My name is Claire. I am 29 years old, and I teach fifth grade at a public school in Columbus, Ohio. Last spring, I attended my half-sister's family reunion dinner, a fancy event our grandmother organized for her 80th birthday. I arrived in a modest blue dress, found a seat near the end of the table, and told myself to stay quiet and enjoy the evening. But about an hour into dinner, my half-sister stood up, pointed at me from across the room, and laughed. "Oh, that's just my little sister," she said loudly. "Don't get too excited, she's only a schoolteacher." A few of the guests chuckled. Someone near the center of the table even said, "Bless her heart." I smiled and looked down at my plate. I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. But then, from the far end of the long dining table, a woman in a deep burgundy dress slowly set down her wine glass and looked directly at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to pull something from the back of her memory. And then she said, very quietly but loud enough that the table went still, "Wait. Are you the teacher from Riverside Elementary?" Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say something. I have been a teacher for 6 years. I have sat in traffic at 6 in the morning, bought classroom supplies with my own money, stayed until 7 at night, helping a child understand fractions, written recommendation letters at midnight, and attended school plays on weekends because I promised a nervous 8-year-old I would be there. I have never once described any of that as extraordinary. It is simply the job. It is simply who I am. But that evening, in a room full of people who thought my life was small, something happened that I was not prepared for. And it started the way all unexpected things do, quietly, with a stranger's eyes. My grandmother's home sat outside the city, a long white house with a wraparound porch and a formal dining room. She only opened for special occasions. She had turned 80 in March, and my aunt had spent weeks organizing the dinner, catered food, cloth napkins, a string quartet playing softly in the adjoining room. The guest list was a mixture of family and close friends, which in my grandmother's world meant doctors, attorneys, and people who described their profession by their industry rather than their actual job. My half-sister Rachel had always fit perfectly into that world. She was 34, had married a man who ran a commercial real estate firm, and carried herself through every room like she was being quietly evaluated and had already won. Rachel and I shared a father, but little else. After my parents divorced when I was 7, I grew up with my mother in a small apartment near downtown. Rachel stayed with our father in the suburb, in a house with a backyard pool and a housekeeper named Gloria. We saw each other at holidays and at the occasional family gathering, and for most of our lives we maintained a polite, careful distance, the kind of distance that passes for peace if no one looks too closely. I parked on the street because the driveway was full. I straightened my dress in the car window, picked up the card I had written for my grandmother, and walked up the stone path to the front door. My aunt greeted me in the foyer and told me the dining room was nearly full, so I should find a seat wherever there was space. I followed the sound of conversation down the hallway and stepped into the room. The table was enormous. My grandmother had always had that table long enough to seat 20, made of dark wood that had been in the family since before I was born. Tonight it was covered in white linen, set with china I recognized from childhood, and lined with people I mostly knew by name but rarely by conversation. I spotted my grandmother near the center, laughing with one of her oldest friends. I caught her eye and she smiled broadly and waved me over. And I went to hug her and wish her happy birthday before finding a seat at the far end of the table, near a cousin I liked and 2 family friends I had met once before. Rachel arrived about 15 minutes after I did. I heard her before I saw her, that particular laugh she had, high and deliberate, designed to fill a room. She came in wearing a cream-colored dress and heels that clicked against the hardwood floor, and behind her, her husband followed with the practiced ease of someone who had attended many rooms like this one. They moved through the crowd easily, greeting people with kisses on cheeks and familiar first names, and I watched from my end of the table the way you watch a performance you have seen before and already know the ending to. Dinner began. The caterers moved through with plates of roasted chicken and glazed carrots and warm bread, and around me the conversation settled into comfortable rhythms. Someone's daughter was getting married. Someone's son had switched jobs. The summer had been unusually hot, wasn't it? I talked with my cousin about her new apartment and listened to the family friend beside me describe a trip to Portugal. It was pleasant. It was fine. I had no expectations for the evening beyond getting through it gracefully and making my grandmother feel celebrated. That is when Rachel stood up. She did not tap a glass or ask for attention formally. She simply rose from her chair, which was near the center of the table where the light was best, and raised her voice to a volume that made conversations pause naturally. She smiled around the room with the ease of someone who had never once been afraid of being the center of attention. "I just want to take a moment," she said, "to introduce a few people to the family members they might not know as well." She gestured toward her husband's business partner and his wife, who were seated nearby. She introduced another couple who had traveled from Atlanta. And then she turned her head, and her eyes found me at the far end of the table. "And that," she said, waving a hand in my direction, "the way you might point at a piece of furniture you want to acknowledge without really drawing attention to, is my little sister, Claire." She paused just long enough. "She's only a schoolteacher, so don't go asking her for stock tips." A few people laughed. Not unkindly, the way people laugh at a harmless joke, but enough that the sound settled over me like something warm and unpleasant. Someone near her said, "A teacher, how sweet." Another said, "Public school?" And when I nodded, there was a brief silence that said everything the words did not. I smiled. I picked up my fork. I did not explain myself. Here is something I have understood for a long time. The people who use the word only before a job title have never had to depend on that job the way other people have. No one says only a teacher when their child is the one who finally learned to read. No one says it when a classroom becomes the one place a kid feels safe enough to show up every single morning. They say it at dinner parties, in passing, when what they mean is that the job cannot be measured in money or titles, and therefore, in their accounting, it does not fully count. I have never found a useful way to argue that point in the moment. So I have stopped trying. What I did not expect was for the argument to be made for me. The woman in the burgundy dress was seated at the opposite end of the table from Rachel, closer to where I sat. I had noticed her when I first arrived. She was elegant in a quiet way. Silver earrings, dark hair pulled back, the kind of stillness in her posture that suggests someone who has learned to take up space without announcing it. My grandmother had introduced her earlier in the evening as Margaret, an old friend from the neighborhood, though I gathered from the conversation around her that she was considerably more than that. Her husband, who sat beside her and had been deep in conversation most of the evening, had been mentioned more than once in connection with a foundation that funded children's hospitals across the state. After Rachel's introduction, Margaret had gone still. She was not watching Rachel. She was watching me. I noticed it the way you notice when a room's temperature changes not dramatically, but distinctly. She was looking at me the way people look at a word they recognize but cannot immediately place, like a song heard through a wall. I glanced back at her and smiled politely and returned to my plate. But she kept looking. And then, just as the conversation around the table picked back up again, and someone near Rachel started asking about her upcoming vacation to Tuscany, Margaret set down her wine glass, leaned slightly forward, and said my name, Claire. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the ambient noise at our end of the table. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you is your last name Morrison?" I looked up. "Yes," I said. "It is." She held my gaze for a moment. "And did you teach at Riverside Elementary? On the east side?" I felt something shift in the room, the way attention moves when a conversation becomes something that other people want to hear. "I did," I said. "I taught there for 3 years. I transferred to a school closer to home last year." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the table, then back up at me, and when she did, something in her expression had changed. It was not quite recognition yet. It was the moment just before recognition, when everything clicks into place, but you are still catching your breath. "5th grade," she said softly. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. She exhaled slowly. She turned toward her husband beside her and said something quietly that I could not hear. He looked up from his conversation and toward me. And then Margaret turned back to the table and said, in a voice that was steady but carried the particular weight of something important, "I want to tell everyone here something. If that's all right." The table grew quieter. My grandmother, who had excellent instincts for the emotional temperature of a room, looked toward Margaret with gentle attention. Rachel paused mid-sentence. 3 years ago, Margaret began. My son was in the 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. She looked at me as she said it. His name is Daniel. And he was having a very hard time. She said it the way parents say that phrase when what they mean is something much larger and more frightening than the words suggest. A hard time. I knew what that meant when it was Daniel. I remembered Daniel. He had been diagnosed with severe anxiety the previous year, Margaret continued. He was also struggling with a reading comprehension gap that his previous teachers hadn't caught early enough, so by 5th grade, he was behind and he knew it. And for a child who is already anxious, knowing you're behind and not understanding why she paused. It is a very isolating thing. He stopped wanting to go to school. He stopped sleeping. He would come home some days and not speak for hours. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. My husband and I were frightened. We had resources. We could hire tutors. We could switch schools. We could do all the things that money makes possible. But Daniel didn't want tutors. He didn't want to switch schools. He wanted to stop feeling like the stupidest kid in the room. The dining room was very quiet now. The string quartet in the next room had shifted to something slow and soft, and the sound drifted through the doorway like it was giving the silence room to breathe. His teacher that year, Margaret said, called me in September. Within the first 2 weeks of school, she had noticed that Daniel rushed through reading assignments and then couldn't answer questions about them, and she wanted to understand why before she assumed anything. That kind of attention, the willingness to notice one child. In a classroom of 24 children, in the first 2 weeks, that is not something I took for granted. I want you to know that. She looked around the table. She started keeping Daniel for 15 minutes after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not because she was required to. Because she asked him if he wanted help, and he said yes. I remembered those Tuesdays and Thursdays. I remembered Daniel sitting at the small reading table in the corner of my classroom while the hallway outside emptied and went quiet, working through paragraphs with a yellow highlighter and a patience that took him months to develop. He had a habit of apologizing when he made a mistake, before anyone said a word. That was the part that had stayed with me. I'm sorry, he would say, quietly, before I had even registered the error. I spent a long time convincing him that mistakes were not something you apologized for, that they were just information. That information was the whole point. She never once made him feel small, Margaret said. And I know that because Daniel told me. He was not the kind of child who talked easily about school, but he told me about his teacher. He told me she never sighed when he got something wrong. He told me she let him pick the books they read together because she said reading should feel like something you chose, not something that was done to you. She smiled slightly at the memory. By February, his comprehension scores had improved by nearly 2 grade levels. By the end of the year, he had tested out of the reading support program entirely. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. He is in 8th grade now. He is on the honor roll. Last month, he told us he wants to be an environmental lawyer. Someone near the center of the table made a soft sound. My grandmother pressed her fingers together in front of her mouth. At the end of that school year, Margaret continued, I tried to thank his teacher properly. I went to the school. I brought flowers. I know, flowers. She was too kind to say they were insufficient, and I told her what that year had meant to our family. She told me she was just doing her job. Margaret looked at me steadily. I believed her then, and I believe her now. But I want to offer a small correction to that, if she'll allow it. She paused. Doing your job, the way she did it, is not a small thing. It is an extraordinary thing, and it deserves to be named that way. The table was silent. From my end, I could see Rachel. She had sat down sometime during Margaret's story. I was not sure exactly when. Her glass was in her hand, but she was not drinking. Her expression was difficult to describe. It was not quite shame, not quite surprise. It was the particular look of someone who has made a joke and watched it land badly and is now recalculating in real time. Margaret looked at me once more. Your sister called you only a schoolteacher. She said the phrase gently, without accusation, simply stating what had been said. I want the people at this table to know what that looks like up close. It looks like a woman staying late on a Tuesday when she could have gone home. It looks like a child learning that he is not broken. It looks like a family sleeping again. She reached for her wine glass. There is no only in that. There never was. For a moment, no one spoke. And then my grandmother, who was 80 years old and had earned every one of those years, began to clap. Not enthusiastically, not dramatically, just a slow, deliberate applause that said, "I am choosing to honor this." A few others joined her. The man beside Margaret reached over and put his hand on top of his wife's. My cousin, seated 2 chairs from me, looked at me with an expression that made me have to look away. I felt heat in my face and a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment. It was something else. Something closer to the feeling of being genuinely seen after a long time of moving quietly through rooms. I wanted to say something, but the words felt inadequate in proportion to what had just been said. So I looked at Margaret and I told her the only thing that felt true. "Daniel was the one who did the work," I said. "I just tried to make sure the room was worth showing up to." She smiled at that. The dinner resumed after a while. The caterers came through with dessert, a birthday cake with white frosting and 80 small candles that took 3 attempts to light fully, and the room shifted back toward warmth and laughter and the ordinary texture of a family gathering. My grandmother blew out the candles to a chorus of "Happy Birthday," and someone started a toast that led to several others. And the string quartet shifted into something livelier that made the older guests tap their feet. But something had settled differently over the table. The people who had chuckled at Rachel's introduction now found other places to direct their attention. An older man who had asked public school, with that particular pause, now went out of his way to refill my water glass and ask where exactly Riverside Elementary was and whether I had always known I wanted to teach. A woman near my grandmother asked me about the reading program Margaret had described. A younger couple friends of one of my cousins told me they were thinking about school options for their daughter, who was starting kindergarten in the fall, and could they ask me a few questions. I spent the next hour in more genuine conversation than I had experienced at any family event in recent memory. At some point in the evening, Margaret found me near the dessert table, where I was cutting a second slice of birthday cake that I absolutely did not need and absolutely was going to eat anyway. She put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "I should have found you sooner. I wasn't sure you were the same person until I heard your name." "I'm glad you said something," I told her. "Daniel still talks about you," she said. "He doesn't always remember the specific lessons, but he remembers how he felt in that classroom, like someone was paying attention." I thought about that for the rest of the drive home. About how that is perhaps the smallest and most important thing a person can do for another person. Not solve their problem, not save their life, simply pay attention. Be present. Make the room worth being in. It is not glamorous work. It does not photograph well. It will not land you a seat at the center of any table. But it is real, and it matters, and sometimes not often. Not on any schedule you can predict someone in a room will name it out loud, and the silence that follows will say everything that needs to be said. Rachel left early. I noticed her and her husband slipping out around 9 o'clock, just before the second round of toasts. She caught my eye once near the door. She did not speak. She gave me a look I could not fully read, something between discomfort and something more complicated, and then she walked out. I do not know what she made of the evening. I do not know what she carried home. That is not mine to know. What I know is that I stayed until my grandmother grew tired and needed to rest. I helped my aunt carry plates to the kitchen while the caterers packed up, and I sat with my grandmother in her favorite chair while the house emptied around us, and she held my hand and said, "I always knew what kind of person you were, Claire. I'm glad everyone else got to find out tonight." I drove home through the quiet streets. The night was warm and the windows were down, and I thought about Daniel, who wanted to be an environmental lawyer. I thought about the Tuesday afternoons in my classroom when the hallway went quiet and the only sound was the scratch of a pencil and a small voice reading slowly, carefully, getting it right. I thought about all the things that happen in classrooms that no one ever sees. The moments that don't make it into any conversation at any dinner table. The work that gets done in the in-between spaces of a day by people who show up for it simply because it needs to be done. I have been called only a teacher more times than I can count. By strangers at parties, by relatives at holiday dinners, by a man I dated once who said it without thinking, and then tried to take it back when he saw my face. I have never found those words particularly wounding. What they reveal has always been more about the speaker than the speaker ever intends. But I would be dishonest if I said that evening did not mean something to me. That being named not by my own mouth, but by someone else's, unprompted, in a room full of people did not leave something in me feeling steadier than it had before. There is a reason the work of teaching is invisible to most people. It happens in rooms that adults have already left. It happens in the small, unhurried moments that don't generate headlines or performance reviews or stock options. It happens in the accumulation of 15-minute Tuesday afternoons, in a highlighter passed across a table, in the decision to notice one child's hesitation before assuming it is stubbornness. Most of it is never seen. Most of it does not need to be. But every now and then, something circles back. A child grows up. A parent remembers. A woman in a burgundy dress sets down her wine glass and says, "Let me tell you what I know about this person." I did not go to that dinner expecting anything. I came with a card for my grandmother and a willingness to be present and a dress that was comfortable and nothing more. I left with something I did not know I was missing. Not recognition, exactly. Not validation. Something quieter than that. A confirmation of something I already believed but rarely heard spoken aloud. That what I do matters, that how I show up changes things, that the room being worth showing up to is not a small accomplishment. It is, I think, perhaps the only accomplishment that fully counts. I got home a little after 10. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and graded the math quizzes I had been putting off since Thursday. 24 papers, third row of the stack. A boy named Marcus who had been struggling with long division for 3 weeks and had finally gotten every problem right. I circled the score at the top. I wrote, in red pen, "You figured it out. I knew you would." Then I moved on to the next paper. That is the job. That is all of it, and that is more than enough.